Do you know someone in your life that may have difficulty concentrating or focusing on what's important to them? Well, perhaps that person is you. And today's guest, Antonia Bowring, is joining us for the second time to talk about her experience with planning and prioritizing. She considers this to be an act of self-care, and it's a great mindset to consider when we're putting together what we're going to do throughout the week or what we're going to achieve in a day. I encourage you to listen and share this with others who would benefit from being able to focus on what's really important. Antonia, welcome back to the After Dinner Leadership Podcast.
Thank you,
It's
Simon.
a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you here again. Yeah,
Thank you.
Likewise. One of the things that we spoke about last time was the risks of learning and the development of that. And clearly, you've taken your learning into another book, which we'll talk about later in the conversation. But before we get into that, I really would love to just start with a couple of questions for those who haven't listened to the earlier episode. And if you haven't, please go and listen to episode 67, where we talk about coach yourself in more detail. But for those who haven't listened, that may be new to you, I'd like to ask a few questions. The first one actually is, we're talking about being around the after dinner leadership table. What food reminds you of your childhood?
I'm going to answer that with two ways, positively and negatively. Negatively would be a lot of boiled potatoes. My mother is from England. And positively, it would be Christmas baking.
What does that involve?
Well, shortbread, gingerbread men, and then, you know, the sort of recipes that get handed down that get covered in splatters of this and that are only made once a year at Christmas, and everybody sort of has their favorite one. Oh, you've got to make this or that. And I love those traditions of particularly Christmas baking. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so do I. I love the tradition of eating the product of Christmas baking. It's a wonderful tradition I have. We spoke about this time last year. So both times we've kind of been between this Thanksgiving and Christmas period in our listenership. So, and food is a big part of those holiday times, isn't it? So, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it is.
Great. And if I take you back to your early 20s, what's memorable about you as a 20-year-old?
I'd like to answer that by telling you a very brief story, which is I did my undergraduate degree living at home in Vancouver, and I was applying for graduate school. And I applied to and got into London School of Economics to do a master's in urban planning. As I recall, it was a while ago, I accepted. They offered me some kind of funding, but not full funding. And then there was a requirement that I had to take some math course, probably calculus. And I remember the fluorescent light in my bedroom at the big oak desk. And I remember looking at this, it was probably a piece of paper, and going, well, I can't go. I can't do math. Even though I had done statistics, and I turned it down, lost my deposit on the housing, and didn't go because I was so afraid that I would fail at calculus. And, you know, as I'm telling you that story, I am working very hard actually to control my emotions, because I think that's a very sad story. And I wish two things: that I had just had more confidence and could look back at my track record and see that I had been able to do whatever I set out to. And secondly, I wish I had had a mentor, a relationship with some adult that would have helped me see there were other options than looking at it so black and white. Yeah.
No, I can get that. I appreciate you sharing it. I mean, that's a very personal experience, and I'm grateful for you sharing it. So where did you end up?
I ended up at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex and did a Master's of Philosophy in Development Economics. Fantastic experience, you know, set me up for many great things to come. But I still remember that as a very
Yeah.
sort of pivotal, you go one way or the other, and the rest of your life unfolds in a particular way.
Yeah, I love projecting some of that, and it is fascinating to think, well, what if, and all that type of thing. Not just in a regretful way, but like in a,
Right,
wow,
right,
on these hinges, these little decisions are made, relationships formed that you wouldn't have met otherwise. These type of things,
right.
fascinating.
Ex-
You mentioned mentors there, that there wasn't someone for that decision, but if you, not specifically as a 20-year-old, but maybe in your 20s, is there someone that stands out as
mm.
a mentor figure for you? Maybe in some other context.
You know, there was one in my late 20s. So I would first say
Hmm.
this was something that I lacked in my 20s. And I really encourage clients I have today to lean into, I'm going to call it that responsibility. I
Yes.
had one in my late 20s. Her name was Nancy Barry, and she was my manager at the World Bank. And when she went to be the CEO of a nonprofit that worked in microfinance, she took me with her. And the power of a thank you and note. I'm just going to note that for your viewers. And what she did was literally just threw me in and said, okay, create an entrepreneurial training program for Latin American women in Italy, go. And she was a mentor in that she had undying belief in me and really gave me a carte blanche. So that she was a very important mentor in, I think, building confidence. And
Yes.
I I would love to mention one more who was much, much later in my life.
Go for
Uh,
it.
yeah, and it's how I became an executive coach. And her name was Joanne Kilmeyer, and
Hmm.
she was a pro bono executive coach at an organization I was running. And this organization, it's a long story, went belly up. And she said to me, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And she said, "You should take my executive coaching course. You're a natural." And that's the easy part of the story. She was so generous in her wisdom and in her empathy and her warmth and in her networks. She sadly passed several years ago. And do you know, I think of her every week, at least once. She had a
Wow.
profound impact on me. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember you talking about her last time that we spoke as well, and so she's clearly in your consciousness. Now, what a great
Yeah.
legacy! Yeah, fantastic. Now, last time we met, you'd released a book called Coach Yourself, and I'd love to hear your reflections
Mm,
about what you've learned about leadership since writing, and having time for that book to kind of hit the
mm,
market and the audience that you were writing it for. What have you learned from it?
mm. Well, I've learned four things. One very personal. I love writing, but I do
Yeah.
not love the promotion of it. And I didn't realize that. That was interesting, and I have to deal with that going forward. It's Yeah, that's one thing. But the three things that I learned as a kind of reaction to the book are, there were two topics in the book, well, three, that all the podcasts, all the interviews, everything gravitated towards. And that was, first of all, the values exercise in it.
Yeah.
So I start every coaching engagement with a values inventory exercise with my clients. And that is so universally appreciated. The
Yes.
second was a framework in it on how to have a critical conversation called COIN. And that too, I think it might be the moment in time where critical conversations feel very difficult to have, very polarized opinions. Um, and it's so simple. It's like a little checklist you put in your back pocket, because when emotions run high, it's very easy to get off track in a critical conversation, and it
Yes.
just keeps
Yes.
bringing you back. And the third is the really powerful interest in my ADHD journey. I talk a little bit about it in one chapter. I use some case studies of clients in the various chapters, but there was a lot of interest in both my diagnosis and just my journey, and kind of integrating that diagnosis into who I am in my work.
Yeah. Well, that's where, on that last point, we spent quite a bit of time talking about that. It was a spark that came up in
Yeah.
our conversation, and
Yeah.
indirectly, and we ended up speaking for quite a lot of time about that. Absolutely. So, was that something prior to you writing Coach Yourself? Was that something you would talk about a lot anyway? The ADHD
The
piece. Would it come up a lot before
so
the book?
yeah, that's a good question. So I have written, oh, maybe a dozen articles about it. So it's
Hmm.
come up that way. Um, I probably talk about it more frequently now. And it was definitely the impetus for writing the ADHD Success Planner. That
Yes.
really came out of the reaction to Coach Yourself.
Yeah. All right. So, at what point did you then say, "Hold on a minute, there's something here. I need to write this success planner"? How far into the journey were
Yeah.
you when you realized there's an opportunity here to help?
The short answer to that is, and I'm sure I said this before, because I always say I feel very strongly that there are two intersecting pieces of the ADHD journey: the profound and the practical. And the profound,
Yes.
in essence, is how do you integrate this into your self narrative? And how do you also permit yourself to acknowledge and accept and leverage? I'll call them superpowers, but let's call them the gifts it delivers to you.
Yes.
But the second piece, which is more the focus of the ADHD Success Planner, is at the same time, we have to get reports in on time. We have to pay bills. We have to file our taxes on time. We have to pick up the children from whatever on time. So, from a practical point of view, what is the scaffolding in your life that you have or create in order to get things done on time, so that people can see you as someone they can rely on? So
Understood.
that's more the focus of the Success Planner. It's on prioritizing and planning as an act of self-care.
Right. So you've labeled it ADHD Success Planner.
Yeah.
How do you define success?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that was the much sexier name that my friend in publishing suggested. Mine was something like plan and prioritize with ADHD or something, like not very sexy. Success, for in terms of this particular ebook, focused on prioritizing and planning. I think it's a success if you can see planning and prioritizing as an act of self-care. To me,
Yes.
that would be a success. A second success would be I would love it if you took the whole system and implemented it, but if you took any elements of it and used them to be efficient and effective in getting stuff done, that would be success.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah, that's it's a good start. So self-care, let's explore that a little bit. An act of self-care. Why have you targeted that as a
Yeah.
as a phrase? What, explore that for me.
Yeah. I want to say one caveat before I answer that this book says ADHD in its title, but this prioritization and planning system, I have introduced to almost every executive and professional I coach if they have issues with getting things done. So yes, ADHD is in the title. It is useful for anyone who just has challenges in some areas of executive function. So I wanted just to say that. But the reason why it's self-care is for someone with ADHD, there's a lot of like things that happen every day that little negative voice can say, oh, again, you weren't concise, or oh, again, you were impulsive, or oh, you missed that deadline again, or over and over. Self-care to me is finding a way to quiet and eliminate those voices to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And a way to do that is have more control over what you do and when. And the way you do that is creating some time where you plan and prioritize. And that is profound self-care because it puts you in a position of more control. It puts you in a position where you start the week with lower cortisol levels. It puts you in a position where you see the week with a more positive energy. And it also communicates to others that you take being reliable and accountable as something that's important to you.
Yeah. So you've used accountability before, and if I can pull strands in of what you were saying. So we've got the ADHD potential focus, but we're saying any executive, any leader who might be struggling to focus, struggling to fulfill their commitments, perhaps the agreements that they've made with others, their accountability. Maybe there's a reputation building up that they're not someone that can be relied upon to deliver the outcomes, maybe struggling to manage the workload they're on. This could be useful for. Have I got anything wrong there?
No, that's excellent.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Oh, nice. So let's dip into the planner then. What are some of the 3 or 4 key steps that someone would go through if they're using this planner? What is it?
Yeah. So there's 4 parts to it. And the first is actually not covered in the book because if it's 2023 and you don't use a calendar, you better take a serious look. So an assumption is that you use a calendar, and that's the first. So you could call that a first step because you might be wondering, Simon, is there anyone who doesn't use a calendar? And you would be shocked by how many people there are. So that's part 1. Part 2 is what I just call, it's what I just referred to as like this self-care time, this dedicated time, half an hour, 45 minutes, once a week, ideally Saturday or Sunday, where you sit down and take control of the week ahead. The third point would be the weekly buckets list. And that is where you, in your planning session, scan the week back, what you got done, scan the week forward, look at your calendar, any other information you have, and you put down, I think on paper, research shows it's more effective on paper, but it could be on a notes app or whatever.
Yeah.
What are the buckets of to-dos next week? And for example, I'll give you a couple of examples of buckets. My business admin would be a bucket. And I would put 2 or 3 things that I know I need to get done this week. Obviously, if it's the end of the month, it would be invoicing. Another example of a bucket might be if I had a big project, let's say I was delivering a big workshop, that actually might be its own bucket, and it would have 2 or 3 to-dos under it. So there's something about the arc of looking at the week as a time block that, from my experience working with so many different clients, just we can hold in a way that a month or a quarter is very difficult to hold.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean
Yeah,
you don't look further ahead, but you bring it down to, okay, I've got a week ahead of me. What does the map of that sort of look like? And very importantly, in the weekly buckets list, you're not saying Thursday at 10 a.m. I'll do this. You're just collecting the buckets of to-dos for the week.
Yes.
And that is, I have had clients tell me this, and it is also my experience. Sometimes the daily to-do lists don't get done in a methodical way, but there's something about being able to carry that weekly buckets list that is almost enough to keep it in the front of our prefrontal cortex, what we have to get done.
Sure.
So that's part 3. Very quickly.
Yep.
Then there's the daily to-do list. And I give 3 different variations in the ebook. And by the way, there's templates for the buckets list and the daily to-do list. And there's, very detailed on in term of time blocks, bigger time blocks, and then just AM, PM. And the daily to-do list becomes quite easy and quite fluid to do at the end of the day when you have this weekly buckets list.
Yes.
That's the system.
Yeah. Great. And in what ways has that helped you specifically with the ADHD side? What are the difficulties that has helped to resolve or to strengthen?
Yeah.
For you personally, I guess.
Yeah. Personally, it's the simplicity of it. It's not complex. I'm not relying on different apps, different books. I don't have to lug things around. It's very transportable. That's one very important thing. The second is it's extremely adaptable. So I'll give you an example from a client. She actually said, I actually found it overwhelming to sit down and do the weekly planning session because I didn't know where to start. So she took notes all week on her phone and then printed those up as the starting point for that weekly planning session.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Like, it's so adaptable. And for folks with ADHD, we love bright, shiny objects and novelty. So the ability to tweak it and add shiny objects and change things around, like use a different daily to-do list, things like that, keeps us more engaged. And then the third point I would say is there is that little dopamine hit you get when you get to tick things off. So it's structured in such a way that you get to congratulate yourself and get that little dopamine hit through the whole system.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate that. And you've mentioned that you prefer a paper system. And one of the things that I've noticed is that with technology, as I love it, but also the distraction risk is very high for me. That I open my phone to look at something that's on a list or something, and then I realize 5 minutes later I'm now in a different app doing something else that I didn't pick the phone up to do. And my journaling, for example, I've reverted back to, actually I never left, but I do like the idea of pen on physical paper. There's something about that is really satisfying for me. and I attempted with using my iPad for journaling. It's not the same. I use my iPad for work a lot. I make notes like I am now, and I love it. It's a wonderful device. But from keeping a personal journal, and for that aspect, for me, it still has to be pen on paper. I don't know what the science is behind that, but I'm sure there is something. But I really appreciate it. And there's something in the planning process which we use a tool for my small business where we have a system that we can all see. So that's the beauty of it being online and virtual. But part of me still misses that paper, that pen and paper aspect of planning that I used to use many years ago.
Yeah. Well, so lots of different threads there. One is I totally agree with you about journaling. And I even take it to I wouldn't call it extreme, but to the point where I only use one kind of notebook. They're quite expensive, by the way. And I only use one kind of pen. And there's that ritualistic piece that is an important part of it being a habit, I think. So I appreciate that comment.
I think we're probably we're in harmony there for sure.
The other thing I would say is, it's so important, ADHD or not, to understand how you learn and retain information best, right? So for example, and also what works in your work environment, I am very visual. In front of my desk is a big vision board for the year. I often will pull up from facilitating, these sticky big sheets of paper and kind of put something on it and capture my to-dos that way. Now that works for me because I spend a lot of my day on Zoom, right? That wouldn't work for me if I was moving around. I would need something that I could move around with. So it is important to know how you absorb and retain information best.
Great.
And then just one more point I'd like to make, which is, obviously I have clients that use project management tools and, various productivity apps like Notion and, the whole Google system or whatever. But at the same time, if I said to you, Simon, business, podcast, home, what are the few things you got to get done this week? Where are they listed in one place where you can see them and it helps hold you accountable?
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. They tend to end up on a large lined Post-it note at the moment. So the system is working well, but it's not consistent with what I used to do years ago, which was probably a bit more effective. So it's a good question. Thank you for the agitation. I appreciate it. Antonia, I have a question for you. There's a sequence that's developing here. Coach Yourself, the Success Planner. What's next?
I am putting in my proposal for my next book, hopefully by the end of December. And that is definitely on my weekly buckets list. And I have a whole bunch of ways to make sure I don't procrastinate on it. I'm going to write another book about ADHD and leadership, but it's going to be really interview and survey based, and
Understood.
not secondary research. I think that it is still, there's a huge stigma, particularly in, I'll say, corporate America, corporate wherever. Not maybe so much in the founder startup world, but I think we haven't yet really mined the lessons learned, the gifts, and the individual array of scaffolding that leaders use to ensure that they're also reliable.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a great development of the idea and the thinking. I'm sure it'll be a great benefit to that community. It was good. I want to go back as we close to your 20-year-old self. If you can imagine her sitting in front of you now, and maybe the dilemma she was facing with this LSE application and the calculus test or whatever it was, what advice would you give her?
Can you think beyond black and white thinking? Can you invoke more creativity into this? And secondly, who are 2 or 3 trusted, wise folks that you could share your insecurities and fears with, who may help you develop a different perspective?
Thank you. Great counsel. Appreciate your input and the work you're doing, and I'm really pleased that you've been able to advance it into some further thinking that's going to benefit leaders and in the future. So thanks, Antonia, for joining us again. And please let us know when you have the ADHD leader book, whatever the title ends up being there.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
yeah, we'd love to talk about that again. I think it's a really helpful perspective you're bringing to the world. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your work and your podcast and your very empathetic view on leadership and what it takes to be a good leader.
Thank you. See you again soon. Thank you for joining us at the After Dinner Leadership Table, and trust that you've got good value from listening to this episode. Thanks for being here. One question for you. The question is, so what? What will you do with what you've just heard? And here's a few suggestions. Number 1, lead with more purpose. 2, mentor with patience. 3, share with pride. You think of anyone who you know that would benefit from listening to what you've just heard, that would help them to be a better leader today or in the future. Please share, like, subscribe. It helps other people to consume the content. And we wish you all the very best of success. And please listen again to another After Dinner Leadership conversation.